What if everything we think we know about how civilization started is wrong? What if the first kings didn't rule for just decades, but for thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years? Between history and legend, there is one ancient tablet that tells us about an impossible past. It is called the Sumerian King List, and it doesn't work like a normal history record should. Before we continue, take a moment to get comfortable. Let the quiet settle around you. And before you get too comfortable, please take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what we do here. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. The story starts in the rich farmlands of the Fertile Crescent, which is modern-day Iraq. Scientists digging through the dust of ancient cities once found a small dark tablet written in cuneiform, the oldest known form of writing. The language belonged to the Sumerians, a group of people who suddenly appeared around 4000 BCE with cities, laws, water systems, temples, and a deep knowledge of the stars. It was like civilization itself had suddenly sprung up fully formed from the ground. Among the many tablets discovered in Nippur, Larsa, and Uruk, one seemed to belong to a different world. On it were listed the names of 8 kings: Al-Yalim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, Dumuzi the shepherd, and others. Each one ruled in a single city before the world-changing flood. But next to each name was a reign so incredibly long that it broke all logic. 28,000 years, 36,000 years, even 43,000 years. Together, they ruled for a total of 241,200 years. At first, historians said it was just made-up mythology, a metaphor for godly power. But then came a disturbing discovery. After the flood, the king list continued with names of rulers who were actually proven to have existed. The list moved smoothly from the impossible into the real. There was no clear line between myth and memory, between gods and men. It was as if someone had written history backward, starting with the divine and ending with the ordinary. What did these numbers mean? Some scholars thought the kings were gods, and their reigns stood for celestial cycles, possibly connected to the movement of stars or astronomical ages. Others believed they represented dynasties rather than individual people. But a few voices, quiet and easily ignored, began to ask whether the tablet was recording something the ancient people genuinely believed to be true, a record of rulers from before a worldwide disaster. The Sumerians were careful record keepers. They measured time using a system based on 60 rather than 10, which allowed enormous precision. Their mathematics influenced every civilization that came after them, right down to our minutes and seconds. So when they wrote that Al-Yalim ruled for 28,800 years, it wasn't random. The number fit perfectly into their sacred math. To them, numbers weren't just arbitrary symbols. They were the building blocks of creation. Scientists have long known that flood layers exist in Mesopotamian soil. At Shuruppak, the ancient site connected with the Sumerian flood hero Ziusudra, the prototype of Noah, evidence of a sudden flood, mud and river sediment covering an older civilization, was dated to around 2900 BC. This doesn't prove the ancient kings existed, but it does suggest that the Sumerians remembered a terrible disaster so clearly that it became the dividing line of their entire history, before the flood and after the flood. Still, questions remain. Why did a civilization so focused on order, on writing and record-keeping, include impossibilities in its official record? Why preserve names and reigns that no human could ever achieve? And why carve those names on stone meant to last forever? Perhaps the answer lies in how the Sumerians viewed time. For them, time was not a straight line but a circle. Kingship was not a human institution but a divine gift that came down from heaven. When the king list says, kingship descended in Eridu, it is describing an event both cosmic and earthly, a transfer of order from the gods to humanity. When the flood came, kingship was said to have ascended, withdrawn, and later descended again in Kish. The implication is subtle but staggering. The Sumerians believed civilization itself was a repeating gift, withdrawn and restored over huge periods of time. And that idea of repeating civilization appears everywhere across the world. The Mayans, the Egyptians, the Hindus, the Greeks, all told of golden ages followed by destruction and rebirth. Different lands, different gods, but the same pattern. Knowledge comes down, humanity rises, then falls, and memory becomes myth. Some researchers, like Zecharia Sitchin in the late 20th century, claimed the list described alien rulers, beings whose long lifespans showed they were from another world. His theories have been widely criticized. Yet they reveal a deeper human fascination, the possibility that the timeline of civilization might stretch far beyond what we've been taught. But there are other explanations, quieter and less sensational. Some scientists now suggest that the King List may preserve the echoes of real but forgotten cultures, peoples whose traces were wiped out by floods and by time before the rise of Sumer. Southern Mesopotamia already held older settlements, now buried under mud. Some of these sites, like Tel Abyad, reveal architectural complexity far earlier than official history allows. Could the ancient kings have been leaders of these lost peoples, remembered dimly through thousands of years of retelling? If so, the King List is not a fantasy. It is a memory distorted by survival, a fragment of continuity between worlds. Every civilization records its origin as something divine. For the Sumerians, kingship was not invented. It was given. And perhaps that's the real secret of the list. It was never about who ruled but where power came from. When it says, kingship descended from heaven, it may be describing not gods but knowledge, mathematics, law, language, falling once into human hands, then vanishing again beneath the flood. When you close your eyes and imagine that first sunrise over Eridu, with its mud brick temples rising from the marsh and its priests carving numbers into wet clay, it is hard not to feel a strange familiarity. The same hands that wrote those names are not so different from ours. They too wanted to preserve memory against the tide of forgetting. And yet they knew something we do not. They remembered a time so long that it mocked reason itself. The question stays with us like a whisper buried in the tablet's cracks. Were those 8 kings ever real? Or were they shadows of something older, something humanity once was but no longer remembers? When we read those numbers, we're not just decoding an ancient script. We are decoding a wound in time itself. And perhaps somewhere beneath the shifting sands of southern Iraq, beneath the cities that rose and fell 100 times, there still lies the truth, the first throne, the first king, and the memory of a world that ended long before ours began. The flood has always been more than water. It is memory itself, washing over everything that dares to last. When the Sumerian King List declares that the flood swept over, it isn't describing a simple storm. It is announcing an ending, a reset so complete that it divides existence into before and after. But how much of that flood was real? And if it was, what did it take with it? There is a strange familiarity in the way ancient stories speak of the world ending. It is always sudden, always unstoppable, and yet somehow always remembered. In the cuneiform tablets of Nippur, the gods complain about humanity's noise and corruption, deciding to cleanse the earth. In the Hebrew Bible, the same idea returns. Noah building his ark as the world drowns in divine regret. In the Indian Satapatha Brahmana, a man named Manu saves the seeds of all creatures. In Greek myth, Deucalion and Pyrrha rebuild humankind from stones. Different languages, different gods, but the same flood. What if it wasn't coincidence? What if these were regional memories of the same disaster, passed down through language and ritual, distorted by distance and time? Scientists once believed floods were local myths, perhaps inspired by seasonal river overflows. But as geology advanced, a deeper story began to surface. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth shifted violently into chaos. The Younger Dryas period, as scientists call it, marked a sudden return to Ice Age cold after thousands of years of warming. Ice sheets collapsed. Oceans rose. Meteor fragments, possibly from a breaking apart comet stream, may have struck the planet, starting wildfires and melting ice across the northern hemisphere. When the ice melted again, huge amounts of water poured into the seas, raising global levels by more than 100 meters. In that era, entire coastlines vanished. Coastlines where early human settlements might have stood. The Gulf of Oman, the Persian Gulf Basin, the Black Sea Shelf, all regions now underwater once held fertile plains. Some researchers call the flooded area between modern Iraq and Iran the Eden Delta, a cradle of pre-Sumerian life swallowed by post-Ice Age tides. Could this have been the Great Flood remembered in Sumerian tablets? The evidence grows more curious. Excavations at the site of Shuruppak, the city of the flood hero Ziusudra, reveal a distinct layer of river mud 1 to 2 meters thick, sandwiched between levels where people lived. Radiocarbon dating places this flood around 2900 BC, matching eerily with the end of the ancient section of the King List. Below that layer lie older, simpler structures. Above it, a new civilization arises. The line between myth and archaeology narrows until it becomes almost invisible. And yet the King List does not describe this flood as just a disaster. It calls it a boundary. The kingship was taken up to heaven. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended again from heaven. That sentence is not about water. It is about the loss and return of order, a cosmic interruption after which humanity had to begin again. If the flood was real, then what was erased along with it? Modern geology suggests that much of human prehistory is still buried beneath layers of mud, salt, and ocean sediment. Satellite scans show structures beneath the Persian Gulf floor, possible river channels and delta formations far older than recorded history. In Oman, scientists have discovered evidence of a vast ancient river system, now dry and hidden beneath desert dunes. The Sumerians spoke of 4 great rivers flowing from the Garden of the Gods. Were they describing the real landscape of a world before it drowned? Even our calendars may bear the scars of that flood. The Sumerian calendar begins after the disaster, as if time itself restarted. In Egypt, the earliest dynasties trace their lineage to the followers of Horus, divine rulers said to have reigned before the first human pharaoh. In India, the Kali Yuga began after a cosmic flood that marked the end of an age. Everywhere we look, time seems to have been broken and rebuilt. There's something almost human in that need to begin again. When history breaks, memory reorganizes itself into myth, carrying fragments of truth inside symbols. The flood becomes both literal and spiritual, the drowning of a world and the erasing of its wisdom. Perhaps the King List, in its quiet insistence, was an attempt to rescue fragments of the world that came before. Still, the modern mind hesitates. We are taught to think in straight lines: evolution, development, progress. But the flood stories suggest cycles, ages rising and falling, civilizations erased, memory rebooted. Could it be that the Sumerians were not the first to write, but merely the first to remember again? In 1929, Leonard Woolley excavated the Royal Cemetery of Ur. Beneath layers of gold and lapis lazuli, he found the same strange flood deposit, fine river clay sealing one age beneath another. He called it evidence of the biblical deluge. His peers laughed until similar layers appeared at Kish, at Uruk, at Lagash. The flood was no longer a myth. It was sediment. But sediment is a quiet witness. It does not tell us what it saw. It only waits. Today, geologists use ice cores and isotopes to reconstruct that lost era, tracing dust storms, volcanic winters, and meltwater surges across the planet. They can measure the breadth of the Earth. Yet they cannot explain how memory survived when everything else died. How did stories of a single flood reach Sumer, Egypt, China, and the Americas? Perhaps before the seas rose, humanity was already connected by rivers, by trade, by shared wonder for the heavens. When the waters came, that world vanished, leaving only its shadow in myth. And then there is the matter of the stars. Around the time the floods ended, Earth's orientation shifted, a slow wobble of the axis called precession. To ancient astronomers, the sky itself seemed reborn. New constellations appeared. Old calendars failed. If kingship descended from heaven, perhaps it did so because heaven itself had changed position, a cosmic realignment reflected in human rule. It's tempting to see symbolism in everything. Yet the coincidences are too persistent. 8 kings before the flood. 8 precession cycles marking roughly 240,000 years. Numbers that echo one another like distant reflections. Did the Sumerians encode their cosmic understanding into the reigns of their kings? Or did they remember something far older, an age when kingship belonged to another kind of being, one measured not in generations but in eons? The flood swept over. The calendars broke. The world began again. And perhaps in that silent reset, something was lost that we have never fully regained. A continuity of memory, a thread connecting us to a deeper human past. The clay tablets that remain are not answers, but anchors, holding fragments of that drowned knowledge against the tide of time. As you sit with that thought, imagine the rivers swelling once more, the Euphrates rising, the Tigris darkening, the temple sinking beneath the murky current. Somewhere beneath that flood, sealed in clay, a voice tries to speak. It says only, "There was a world before this one. And if we ever find it, will we even recognize it as our own?" They called it Eridu, the first city. Not just the first in Sumer, but the first on earth. The King List begins there, as though history itself was born in its dust. It says, "When kingship descended from heaven, it descended in Eridu." But who lived in that ancient marshland before the words for kings and gods even existed? Who laid the first brick when the world was still new? Scientists have tried to answer that question for over a century. What they found beneath the desert of southern Iraq did not look like the familiar beginnings of civilization. Eridu, now a ruin called Tel Abu Sharain, lies buried under layers of time. 20 levels of temples, each built upon the last, reaching deeper than any other Sumerian city. The lowest levels date to around 5400 BC. Yet the King List suggests something much older, far beyond the reach of recorded years. Excavations by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd in the 1940s revealed something curious. At the city's core stood a small temple made of mud brick, later expanded and rebuilt dozens of times over thousands of years. Each new layer followed the same sacred layout, like a memory being rewritten again and again. The scientists named it the Temple of Enki, the god of water, wisdom, and the deep. To the Sumerians, Enki was the one who brought order to chaos, the one who taught humans how to build, to speak, to measure. It was as though the temple was not just a structure, but a living record of human consciousness itself. And yet, beneath those temple floors, deeper than any known inscription, the soil whispered something older still. Pieces of pottery unlike anything from later Sumerian times, burned clay figurines, traces of bitumen canals leading toward a vanished sea. The site once stood at the shore of the Persian Gulf, a landscape now miles inland. If Eridu was indeed the first city, then it was also a port, not just of trade, but of transition, between myth and memory, between two worlds divided by the flood. Scholars have long debated whether Eridu represents the cradle of civilization or the echo of something before. Some suggest it was the first attempt to rebuild after the disaster, a sanctuary for survivors carrying fragments of lost knowledge. Others argue it was simply the first city to survive long enough for its name to last. But there are details that resist the neat progression of history. The people who built Eridu already understood irrigation, architecture, and religious symbolism. They placed their temples on raised platforms long before ziggurats existed, aligning them to cardinal directions. They used bitumen mortar, traded marine shells from far coasts, and made tools from imported stone. Civilization, it seems, did not rise gradually here. It appeared whole. What could have caused that sudden leap? The archaeologist Samuel Noah Kramer once called Eridu the starting point of Sumerian history. But what if it was not the starting point, only the continuation of something too ancient to trace? The King List tells us that kingship descended, not began. It implies inheritance, not invention. If kingship is a metaphor for structured knowledge, then Eridu was the moment when that structure re-emerged after silence. There's an odd piece to the ruins today. The air shimmers with heat. The outlines of temples blend into the horizon. Nothing moves except the wind. Yet when you stand among those stones, it feels as though time is pulled there, thick and slow, like the ancient waters that once touched its edges. Scientists found fish bones buried within temple offerings, symbolic of Enki's realm. Some even suggest that the earliest inhabitants worshipped water itself, not as an element, but as a memory of what had drowned them. The myths say Enki lived in the freshwater abyss beneath the earth, called the Abzu. It was from there that he created humankind, forming them from clay to relieve the gods of their work. In later tablets, when the flood threatens to erase all life, it is Enki who warns the hero Ziusudra to build a vessel. The story folds in on itself, and the same god who gives life also preserves it through destruction. Could this cycle reflect a deeper truth, that every birth of civilization carries within it the echo of the last one's end? Eridu's location hints at something more deliberate. The city sits near where ancient river channels once met, channels that no longer exist, now buried beneath the desert. Satellite imagery reveals patterns of waterways that once flowed from the northwest, forming a delta where the first settlements could thrive. Some scientists propose that this network predates the known Tigris-Euphrates system, belonging to a wetter climate thousands of years earlier. In those forgotten rivers perhaps lie the traces of the true first culture, the one erased when the earth changed its surface. Even in language, fragments remain. The name Eridu may come from the Sumerian Eriduk, meaning home built far away. But far from what? Some scholars connect it to the Akkadian Urudu, which means remote city or ancient dwelling. To call a place ancient, one must already possess history. It is as though even the first Sumerians sensed they were walking atop someone else's memory. And so we are left with questions. If Eridu was the first city, who taught its builders the art of shaping clay and channeling rivers? If kingship descended, from where did it fall? The deeper one studies the ruins, the more the layers blur. The oldest walls dissolve into mud, untraceable. Yet the pattern repeats: build, bury, rebuild. A city resurrecting itself every few generations, as though reenacting a story it could not forget. The same ritual spaces, the same altar stones, the same alignment to the sunrise. Civilization reborn like a dream retold by children who remember only fragments. In later ages, Eridu's influence spread across Mesopotamia. Its temple plan became the blueprint for all others. Its god Enki evolved into Ea of the Babylonians, Neptune to the Romans, and even echoes faintly in modern myths of wisdom rising from the depths. But eventually the waters withdrew, the gulf receded, the city dried and died. By the time of Abraham, it was already ruins. Somewhere in those shifting sands lies the transition point where prehistory becomes history, where the mythic kings give way to the mortal ones. The scientists dig. The clay crumbles. The story continues. But the question remains, suspended like the mirage above the desert floor. Was Eridu truly the beginning? Or was it merely the last memory of a world already forgotten? When night falls over the plain, the wind moves across the mounds in low, rhythmic sighs. To some, it sounds like the sea that once touched those shores. To others, it sounds like breathing, slow, ancient, steady. Perhaps it is both. And if you listen long enough, you might almost hear it. The first city remembering the one that came before. Their names have the weight of thunder and the rhythm of breath. Al-Yilim, Alaugar, Enmanluana, Enmangalana, Dumuzi the shepherd. They sound like echoes, like syllables carved before speech had settled into meaning. On the Sumerian King List, these were the rulers before the flood, the kings before kings. Each name, when read aloud, carries a pulse, something half divine, half human, as though memory itself was struggling to remember what a ruler once was. The first of them, Al-Yilim of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. He appears nowhere else in Sumerian literature, no temple inscriptions, no hymns, no family tree, only on that one tablet. But that singularity makes him haunting. To the Sumerians, the first king was not merely a man. He was the connection between heaven and earth, the channel through which cosmic order came down into time. In other words, Al-Yilim was not born. He was appointed. When scientists and language experts examine the King List, they notice something strange. The language of those earliest rulers differs slightly in tone and structure. The syntax feels older, as if copied from an oral source that came before written Sumerian. It suggests that the list may preserve echoes of far more ancient traditions, fragments passed down long before clay tablets existed. To read it is to listen to a song carried across centuries of forgetting. In one fragment, the flood divides time into two columns, before and after. Before it, 8 kings ruled for 241,200 years. After it, the reigns become human, hundreds of years, then decades. It is as if the flood did not merely destroy cities but compressed the rhythm of existence itself, shortening the pulse of life, folding eternity into mortality. Who were these kings that ruled before history began? Some scholars interpret their reigns symbolically. Perhaps each represented a dynasty or an astronomical cycle. If one translates Sumerian numbers not literally but as encoded cycles, the reigns align with celestial precession, each spanning roughly 30,000 years, the time it takes for the Earth's axis to drift through a zodiacal age. In that sense, the 8 kings could mark 8 precessional epochs, the rise and fall of entire worlds beneath different skies. Others find linguistic bridges between these ancient names and those of other early cultures. Al-Yalim bears resemblance to the Akkadian Alima, an epithet of Enlil, Lord of the Air. Dumuzi, or Tammuz, appears later as the dying god of vegetation, beloved of Inanna, whose death and rebirth mark the turning of seasons. Enmanluana translates roughly to Lord of the Crowned Man of Heaven, suggesting a symbolic connection to celestial rule. The King List is not merely a document. It is a mythographic code, where each name contains a cosmology. And yet beyond language, there lingers the unsettling possibility that these names once belonged to beings who were, in some forgotten sense, real, not necessarily gods, not necessarily men, but something in between. Theologian Thorkild Jacobson once proposed that the Sumerians conceived of kingship not as political leadership but as the channel of divine power. A king was the vessel through which divine law entered the human world. To rule was to embody cosmic balance. If that is true, then the pre-flood kings were not merely rulers. They were embodiments of an age when humanity still remembered its connection to the heavens. The descending of kingship was the descent of awareness itself. In later texts, such as the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis epic, we see traces of this transformation. Humanity begins as clay shaped by divine hands. Over time, the gods retreat, leaving humans to carry the weight of their legacy. The divine lifespan diminishes generation by generation until death becomes universal. The same pattern appears in other ancient mythologies. In Genesis, where patriarchs once lived for nearly 1,000 years. In the Hindu Puranas, where yugas shorten with moral decay. In Egyptian chronology, where the Shamsuhor ruled before the first pharaoh. Everywhere, the timeline contracts as memory recedes. What happened to that earlier world, the one where life spanned millennia and knowledge flowed like rivers through stone temples? Perhaps the flood was not just water but a metaphor for entropy, the inevitable collapse of divine order into human limitation. When the deluge came, it did not merely wash away cities. It washed away memory, compressing eternity into mortality. What remains are fragments. A name, a reign, a number beyond comprehension. In that sense, the King List might be a map of decline, the slow forgetting of cosmic time. The first kings ruled across eons because they lived within a world whose rhythm was slower, whose days stretched long beneath another sky. After the flood, that rhythm broke. The world quickened. Lifespans shortened. Time, once circular, became linear. And with that transformation came anxiety, the fear of endings. When we compare the 8 pre-flood kings with the genealogies of other ancient texts, the parallels become impossible to ignore. The Bible lists 10 patriarchs from Adam to Noah, each living extraordinary lifespans, then the flood, then normal years. The Sumerian list names 8 kings, then the flood, then mortal reigns. The pattern is identical, separated by geography and language, but unified in structure. Is this evidence of shared memory or a universal myth pattern born of human psychology? In 2014, a cuneiform fragment discovered in the Skoyan collection added another layer of mystery. It contained a partial duplicate of the King List, but used slightly different numbering as though copied from an even older source. The scribe wrote in a dialect archaic even by Sumerian standards, implying that these tales had been preserved long before the known city-states emerged. It's as if every new discovery only deepens the silence. And what of the kings themselves? The list gives no deeds, no wars, no accomplishments, only names and durations. To modern readers, it seems abstract, almost meaningless. But perhaps that was the point. The Sumerians may have been less concerned with biography than with preserving resonance, the vibration of divine authority through time. Each name was a note in a scale of eternity. When the flood came, that music ended. What followed was a new kind of history, one that could be measured, recorded, and eventually forgotten. The kings after the flood are historical figures. Enmebargizi of Kish, Gilgamesh of Uruk. Their reigns are counted in decades, their deeds carved in stone. The mythic pulse has slowed to the human heartbeat. Sometimes, late at night, when the stars drift over the Mesopotamian plain, one might imagine what it was like before the flood, when the first kings ruled under constellations we no longer recognize, when the rivers flowed through lands now drowned by the sea. Perhaps they were not kings as we understand them, but custodians, keepers of knowledge passed from another age. And perhaps that is why the King List refuses to vanish. It is not a history of power, but a lament for the loss of connection between earth and heaven, between man and memory. The clay tablet sits now in the museum at Ashmolean, silent, unblinking. Its wedge-shaped marks still hold the names of those impossible kings. And if you lean close enough, you might feel something hum beneath the surface. A low vibration, ancient and familiar. Maybe it is only imagination. Or maybe, just maybe, it is the echo of the first language trying to remember itself. The ancients said the heavens were a book. The stars were not distant fires, but inscriptions, celestial cuneiform written across the night. The Sumerians called them the me, the divine decrees that structured existence. They believed that knowledge itself descended through the sky, not from imagination, but from observation, patterns written in light. When they looked upward, they were not searching for gods. They were reading. Some of the oldest tablets ever found, from Uruk and Nippur, describe this reading of the heavens in ways that still unsettle modern scholars. They record eclipses, conjunctions, and planetary alignments that date back long before astronomy was thought to exist. The Sumerians mapped Venus's cycle with near-perfect accuracy. They tracked the 18.6-year lunar node cycle that even later civilizations struggled to understand. And deep among those fragments lies something stranger still, records of constellations that no longer match the modern sky. If we trust their mathematics, some of these alignments correspond to periods around 10,000 BC, long before civilization was supposed to exist. How did they know the heavens as if they had watched them for thousands of years? There are moments when the boundaries of knowledge blur into myth, and the Sumerians walk that border like priests of memory. To them, the sky was not static. It was a living rhythm, a breathing pattern through which divine order flowed. Every temple, every ziggurat, was aligned with a star. Eridu's temple faced the southern horizon where Canopus once rose, the star of navigation and rebirth. Uruk's grand ziggurat faced toward the constellation now called Leo, associated with the goddess Inanna, the planet Venus, and the cyclical descent of light into darkness. These alignments were not decorative. They were architectural prayers. But beneath that sacred geometry lies a deeper puzzle. The precision of these orientations suggests knowledge of axial precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's rotation that shifts the position of stars over thousands of years. Modern science only rediscovered precession with Hipparchus in the 2nd century BC. Yet the Sumerians, 4,000 years earlier, seem to have built their cities as if they already knew. Could it be that this knowledge was inherited from those same antediluvian kings who ruled for impossible spans of time? If kingship descended from heaven, perhaps it was not divine rule that fell, but astronomical knowledge, understanding of cosmic order written into the very structure of their civilization. Among the tablets recovered from Nineveh's great library, one stands apart, the Mul.Apin, an ancient catalogue of the stars. It describes 3 celestial paths, the path of Enlil, of Anu, and of Enki. Each corresponds to a band of declination in the sky, dividing heaven into realms of rule. In other words, the Sumerians didn't merely map stars. They structured the cosmos into divine hierarchies. The universe was administration. Order itself was kingship. And that order, they claimed, had once been broken. The flood, in their cosmology, was not only a deluge of water but a celestial disturbance. When the stars lost their stations, it was as if heaven itself had fallen out of alignment, forcing humanity to begin the task of remembering the pattern. When the priests of Ur gazed at the heavens, they were not making predictions for harvest or war. They were performing acts of restoration, trying to realign their world with the architecture of the cosmos. To read the stars was to rebuild the connection between above and below. Every observation, every calculation, was an act of memory. And perhaps that is why the King List merges rulers and constellations so seamlessly. Al-Yalim, the first king, may correspond to Canopus, the navigator's star. Alaugar, his successor, is linked by some to Sirius, the brightest light in the southern sky, known as the herald of floods. The flood myth, then, might encode not only geological upheaval but astronomical transition, when the precessional cycle moved the pole from one star to another, ending an age. We find echoes of this in Egypt's Dendera zodiac, in India's Yuga system, and even in the Greek notion of the Great Year. All describe epochs defined by the slow drift of stars. What if the King List's 241,200 years are not lifespans at all, but time measured through stellar ages? Each king ruling over a cosmic era of 30,000 years? If so, the Sumerians were chroniclers of deep time, counting not years but skies. It is easy in our electric age to forget that the ancients lived in darkness bright with stars. Their nights were domes of pure mathematics, horizons that spoke in geometry and flame. When they watched Venus vanish below the horizon for 8 days, they saw death and resurrection. When Mars turned retrograde, they felt the gods turning their eyes away. The cosmos was an extension of consciousness, and to understand it was to understand the soul. But even within that reverence lies something strange. The Enuma Anu in Lil, a series of omen tablets, records strange events. A star stood in the east and stayed for 70 days. The sun shone at midnight. The stars fought among themselves. Were these poetic visions or descriptions of real phenomena, perhaps cosmic impacts, atmospheric veils, or cometary visitations? In 2007, scientists analyzing the Burckle crater beneath the Indian Ocean proposed a theory. Around 2800 BCE, a comet fragment may have exploded in the sea, generating megatsunamis that reached the Mesopotamian coast. The data aligns almost perfectly with the Sumerian flood. Could this have been the star that fell into the sea, as one cuneiform text describes? If so, the Sumerians were not only astronomers, they were witnesses. And if they witnessed the heavens altering the earth, it would explain why they saw no boundary between the two. For them, history was astronomy, kingship was celestial, and the fate of cities was written in light long before it unfolded in clay. When modern scholars translate these tablets, they find data, numbers, observations, lists. But read them aloud slowly, in the rhythm of breath and silence, and another layer emerges. The tone is mournful, almost liturgical. It is the sound of a civilization remembering something vast and unspeakable, the moment when heaven and earth were one continuum, when rulers were measured by stars, not sand. Sometimes, late in the desert night, the old constellations rise again over Iraq. The same sky that watched over Eridu and Nippur. The difference is ours, not the stars. They have been writing all along. We just forgot how to read. Perhaps that is what the Sumerians feared most. Not the flood, not destruction, but forgetting. Their temples, their kings, their tablets, all were defenses against the erosion of memory. They looked upward, not out of superstition, but out of longing, to remain aligned with a universe that had once spoken to them directly. And when that voice faded, they carved its echo into clay. The King List survives as one of those echoes. The names, the numbers, the reigns, their coordinates in time's night sky, points of light from which a pattern might still be drawn. But we no longer know the shape it once made. Perhaps that's the quiet irony of civilization. Every age reads the stars differently, thinking it understands, never realizing the record was never written for us. It was written for those who still remembered where they came from. If you walk far enough south, past the cracked salt flats where the Euphrates once wandered, you will find a place where the wind seems to breathe through time. Beneath your feet lies not just sand, but memory compressed layer upon layer. Each layer is a world that once had its own sun, its own silence, its own people. Scientists call it Tel. The Sumerians might have called it the skin of the earth. Beneath these mounds, hidden under meters of clay, there are cities that no one remembers building. When the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated Ur in the 1920s, he expected to find relics of early civilization. What he uncovered instead was a silence so profound that it felt deliberate. Between the known settlements, his team struck a layer of pure mud, sterile, uniform, more than 2 meters thick. Beneath it, to everyone's astonishment, were traces of another culture entirely: tools, pottery, brick foundations, none belonging to Sumer, none fitting the timeline. When Woolley held the first piece from that buried layer, he understood what the ancient texts had whispered all along: there had been something before. He called it the flood layer. Others dismissed it as river silt. Yet the difference was undeniable. Above the mud were the remains of the Sumerian dynasties, kings whose names adorned temples and tablets. Below the mud lay the ghosts of an unknown people. Their bricks were wider, their pottery simpler, their settlements smaller, but somehow older than time itself. Woolley wrote in his notes, "It was as though we had reached the memory of the world." That phrase still lingers, the memory of the world. Across Mesopotamia, the same pattern repeats. In Shuruppak, Lagash, Kish, Nippur, every ancient city sits atop older ruins, each separated by a sudden, unmistakable layer of destruction. In geological terms, these deposits match the flood sediments of around 2900 BCE. But what lay beneath them predates Sumer entirely. Some scientists identify it with the Ubaid culture, a mysterious people who flourished between 6500 and 3800 BC. Yet even the Ubaid seem to emerge fully formed: villages with irrigation canals, temples aligned to the stars, artwork showing serpent-headed figures whose purpose we can only guess. No cradle of their culture has ever been found. It simply appears, already knowing how to build. And then, abruptly, something changes. The flood erases them. The clay buries everything. Civilization restarts. And the Sumerians appear, speaking a language no one can trace to any other family on Earth. Who, then, were the builders beneath the clay? Their fingerprints remain, literally. Some of the earliest bricks bear pressed marks of hands far smaller than an adult's, suggesting children assisted in the labor. Others are etched with strange symbols, precursors to cuneiform. The Ubaid pottery features designs that seem almost mathematical: spirals, intersecting waves, grids that recall the movement of water or the orbits of stars. When analyzed with modern software, some patterns correspond to golden ratios, Fibonacci spirals, and ratios found in nature. Coincidence, perhaps, or memory preserved in geometry. Archaeologist Charles Keith Mazels once suggested that the Ubaid were the cultural foundation upon which Sumer was built, a vanished base, both literal and intellectual. The Sumerians themselves, he argued, may have seen them as the antediluvian civilization, the first kingdom before the flood. The King List begins with Eridu for a reason, because Eridu was built directly atop a Ubaid site. The Sumerians did not create civilization from nothing. They inherited it from the ground. That idea unsettles modern scholarship because it implies continuity where textbooks prefer beginnings. We are taught that history starts at Sumer, that writing and kingship were born there. But the ruins below tell another story, one where humanity's first dawn had already passed, buried under the same clay that preserved its name. Some researchers, more daring than their peers, suggest that the clay itself was not merely a flood deposit but a deliberate burial. That after a disaster, survivors may have entombed sacred sites to preserve them, the way priests later sealed scrolls within caves. If true, then beneath the Mesopotamian plains might still lie sealed chambers of an age we no longer recall, temples, archives, or even libraries that survived the deluge, only to be forgotten by time. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed rectangular anomalies deep below Eridu's mound, regular patterns inconsistent with natural geology. Official excavations remain cautious, but the data whisper of foundations unseen. And yet, even without those discoveries, the evidence of erasure is everywhere. The Sumerian texts themselves speak of lost knowledge, the divine decrees once held in Eridu and scattered by the flood. Later scribes claimed that these tablets of wisdom were recovered piece by piece. Each rediscovered art or science marked the return of memory. In that sense, every Sumerian invention, writing, law, astronomy, was not a creation but a recollection. Beneath the clay, then, lies not only the remains of cities but the buried layers of human consciousness. It is as if civilization itself were geological, each epoch layering over the last, each forgetting becoming the ground from which something new must grow. The question, of course, is how deep it goes. How many forgotten worlds sleep under the ones we've already unearthed? If 2900 BCE marks one flood, what of the melting of the Ice Age seas thousands of years earlier, when whole continents were drowned? Satellite scans of the Persian Gulf basin show riverbeds and deltas from that older epoch, now submerged beneath shallow water. Perhaps this city beneath the clay is not just metaphor but literal truth, an entire landscape of lost settlements extending beneath the modern Gulf, the drowned heart of ancient Mesopotamia. What we call origins might be nothing more than resurfaced fragments of cycles much older than we can imagine. There's a peculiar stillness in that thought, that every civilization stands atop the silence of another, that progress is built on forgetting. When Woolley uncovered the royal tombs of Ur, filled with gold and lapis lazuli, he wrote of the eerie contrast between splendor and stillness. Above him, the modern desert howled. Beneath, the remains of queens and attendants lay perfectly preserved, their jewelry still gleaming under lamplight. He realized then that he was excavating not merely history but identity, the moment humanity began again, believing itself the first. If those below the clay were also human, what stories did they tell before the flood erased them? Did they too wonder where they came from? Did they too build temples, watch the stars, dream of gods who once walked among them? We will never know. What we have are traces, patterns in the soil, alignments of brick, fragments of pottery shaped by hands that never imagined they would be the last. The flood covered them, and we uncovered them again, calling it discovery when it is only remembrance. In the stillness of an excavation trench, when the air hums with heat and the clay dust clings to your throat, you begin to sense what the ancients must have felt, that the earth itself is not solid but layered with memory, and that beneath every foundation lies another. The city beneath the clay sleeps on, untouched, its story written not in language but in silence. And perhaps that silence is deliberate, a kind of mercy, shielding what remains from the noise of our age. Because maybe some knowledge was never meant to be unearthed twice. When the waters rose, they did not merely swallow cities, they drowned the mind. The Sumerians wrote that the flood swept over, a phrase so simple, yet it carries the weight of an ending so complete that even time seemed to hesitate. The clay tablets found in Mesopotamia are quiet about what came before that moment, as if the scribes themselves feared to remember. What remains are fragments, lists of kings, prayers to forgotten gods, the echo of a world undone by water. But perhaps the flood was not just destruction. It was a reset, a cleansing of memory that allowed civilization to begin again, stripped of what came before. Every flood myth carries this same dual nature, punishment and renewal, forgetting and rebirth. In the Eridu Genesis, the gods decree humanity's end because mankind had become too loud, disturbing the divine rest. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood is born of celestial disagreement, Enlil wanting silence, Enki offering mercy. Ziusadra, the chosen one, is warned to build a boat. He survives, releases birds, and sacrifices to the gods who destroyed his world. In that single act, grief turned to ritual. The story of survival replaces the memory of loss. What was once civilization becomes legend, and legend becomes instruction. Begin again. Geology and myth rarely speak the same language, but in Mesopotamia they seem to meet. Beneath cities like Shuruppak and Ur, scientists found that uniform layer of mud, a fine silt 2 meters thick, separating one culture from another. Above it, Sumerian civilization. Below, older settlements, nameless. A global deluge need not have covered the entire earth. It only needed to drown the world as the Sumerians knew it. To them, that was everything. But something about that mud speaks of more than mere disaster. Its texture tells of still water, slow deposition, not violent waves. It suggests not chaos but silence, a long, still inundation. Perhaps that stillness itself was the trauma. Imagine the lands sinking day by day, the horizon turning to sea, the river gods abandoning their courses, the sky growing dim from the haze of retreating storms. 4 months, or years perhaps, the survivors lived on fragments of land, watching the old world dissolve. By the time the waters withdrew, memory itself had rotted away, washed clean like writing on clay left too long in the rain. When the Sumerians rebuilt, they did not rebuild the same world. Their language, their art, their religion all bear traces of loss. The first cuneiform signs appear not as poetry but as accounting, lists of grain, rations, trade goods. Civilization re-emerged through the logic of survival. Writing, that most human act of remembrance, began as a response to forgetting. The flood had erased their past so thoroughly that they were forced to invent memory anew. What the King List preserves, then, may not be an accurate chronicle but a therapy, a way to bridge the abyss between before and after. The impossibly long reigns of the pre-flood kings might represent not time but distance, a psychological measure of how far the survivors felt from the gods who once ruled them. The flood was the boundary, the scar across consciousness. Beyond it lay the divine, on this side, the human. And yet every flood myth carries a whisper of guilt. The gods sent it because of human noise, corruption, arrogance. Could it be that the Sumerians sensed the flood was not entirely external? That the deluge might also symbolize an inner fall, a spiritual amnesia in which humanity forgot its place in the cosmic rhythm? The gods withdrew not because of wrath, but because the connection was broken. Modern researchers have proposed many causes for the floods of early Mesopotamia: glacial melt from the Zagros Mountains, the breaching of ancient lakes, tsunamis from the Arabian Sea. But beyond these explanations lies a more haunting pattern. Around the same time, across the globe, other civilizations told the same story: the Mayans of a sky flood that swallowed the earth, the Greeks of Deucalion's Ark, the Chinese of Nuwa mending the broken heavens. Each culture remembered a moment when the world reset itself, when knowledge was lost and only fragments remained. Could it be that this flood was not a singular event but a metaphor for cycles of civilization, eras rising and collapsing, knowledge gained and drowned? The Sumerians, with their obsession with cyclical kingship, seem to think so. Their records describe history as a succession of divine ages, kingship descending, withdrawn, and descending again. Each descent marked a new attempt at order, as if the gods, or perhaps humanity itself, were testing how much memory could survive the next reset. When you study the Sumerian flood from a modern distance, it becomes less about water and more about data loss. The mud layer is a geological equivalent of a corrupted archive. Beneath it, entire systems of meaning have vanished. The people who lived before the flood left no writing, no myths, only structures and objects without context. We can excavate their bricks but not their thoughts. What vanished was not the body of civilization but its language, the very code by which it understood itself. That silence is what haunted the Sumerians. They could feel the weight of what they no longer knew. Their gods were not creators so much as restorers, bringers of knowledge long buried. Enki, in particular, was said to have hidden the me, the divine decrees of civilization, in the deep waters of the Abzu before the flood, then returned them to humanity afterward. Knowledge was not invented, it was recovered. Perhaps that is what memory truly is, the resurfacing of something thought lost. Some researchers have gone further, suggesting that the Sumerians' obsession with flood and rebirth may reflect not just one event but a pattern repeating across millennia. Every few thousand years, they believed, the world renewed itself through destruction. Each time, a few fragments of the old world survived to seed the next. The King List, then, is not a record of rulers but of recoveries. 15 times kingship descended, 15 times it was lost, 15 times humanity remembered who it was. In this light, the flood is not punishment but mercy. Forgetting allows renewal. To remember everything would be to live forever in the ruins. Still, one can't help wondering what was lost beneath that first tide. The King List's 241,200 years whisper of something too vast for ordinary history, perhaps an entire cycle of civilization erased so completely that it survives only as myth. Did the Sumerians suspect that they were not the first, but merely the latest to awaken from the great forgetting? When the archaeologists lifted the first flood clay from the royal tombs of Uar, they described its smell, an ancient dampness, the scent of river and time mixed together. Beneath it, the older world lay preserved in fragments, a child's toy, a burned foundation, a broken bowl. Every discovery felt like an intrusion into a memory that did not belong to us. The flood that reset memory was not the end of humanity. It was the end of continuity. Before it, the world may have remembered itself as one. After it, memory fractured into nations, languages, myths. The same story retold 1,000 ways, each forgetting a little more. And perhaps that is why the Sumerians kept writing about the flood, not as a warning but as an anchor, to remind themselves that history is fragile, that memory must be tended like a flame, and that what was drowned once could be drowned again. When the rains finally ceased and the rivers returned to their beds, the survivors stood among the ruins and saw the sky reflected in the new pools of water. For the first time, the heavens looked like a mirror. And maybe they understood, in that shimmering reflection, that every flood, whether of water or of time, merely forces the world to remember how to begin. When a civilization rises too suddenly, it leaves behind a tremor in time. The Sumerians did not climb from caves or evolve through slow centuries of invention. They appeared as if remembering something: cities, temples, writing, irrigation, astronomy, all at once. To modern eyes, it looks like a miracle. To the ancients, it was simply a return. They said kingship descended from heaven. But what if what truly descended was knowledge, something older than the flood, older than the clay that buried it? Knowledge that shouldn't exist, and yet does. Scientists have long been puzzled by the sudden sophistication of early Sumer. In a geological blink, they went from scattered villages to city-states with laws, schools, tax systems, and even medical procedures. They knew how to build canals across dry plains, how to align temples with the solstices, how to measure celestial cycles that take generations to observe. When their script first appeared around 3200 BCE, it was already mature. Over 600 characters, complex grammatical structures, even metaphors. Writing did not develop in Sumer. It arrived. Some scholars have called this the Sumerian problem, how a civilization could begin fully equipped. The usual explanations speak of agriculture and river valleys, but the artifacts suggest something deeper, an inheritance. In the ruins of Eridu and Uruk, scientists found tablets describing metallurgy, geometry, and music theory centuries before other cultures reached similar stages. One fragment from Nippur speaks of divine principles governing architecture, wisdom, and kingship, each described as gifts brought from the Abzu, the watery deep. These were not inventions but restorations. To the Sumerians, knowledge was never human. It belonged to the gods and could only be borrowed. Enki, the god of wisdom, was said to store the in his underwater sanctuary, granting them to humankind piece by piece. Every art, every science, every rule of civilization was one of these decrees. The list includes crafts like weaving and carpentry, but also abstract concepts: truth, justice, kingship, even fear. In their worldview, knowledge was a sacred contagion. Once given, it could not be unlearned. But there's a paradox here. The Sumerians credited the gods with everything. Yet their records read like engineering manuals, not revelations. The ziggurats they built were aligned within fractions of a degree to celestial coordinates. Their sexagesimal system, the base 60, still governs our timekeeping today. Their medical texts list anatomical observations with eerie precision. And in one surviving tablet, a scribe notes that the planet Nibiru crosses the heavens every 3,600 years. That orbit does not correspond to any visible body. Was it metaphor or memory of a celestial body lost to time? The deeper one studies Sumerian science, the harder it becomes to dismiss their precision as myth. In the late 19th century, astronomers rediscovered that the Earth's precession causes equinoxes to drift over thousands of years, but certain Sumerian star charts already seem to encode this cycle. The Temple of Enlil at Nippur aligns with the position of Polaris around 4000 BC, a point that only makes sense if they tracked the slow movement of the pole star. They were observing cosmic time long before any written concept of it existed. Such knowledge should not have existed in the world's first civilization, unless, of course, it was not the first. Some researchers argue that Sumer inherited fragments from a pre-flood culture, perhaps transmitted through oral memory or the survival of a few scattered communities. If the flood buried one epoch, the next might have risen on its ruins, mistaking rediscovery for invention. When the King List says, kingship descended, it might describe this transmission of knowledge, civilization handed down like a torch through darkness. Yet the question remains, who carried that torch? In temple reliefs and seals, there appear strange recurring figures, bearded beings in horned crowns, pouring water from twin vases, sometimes holding a bag-shaped object whose purpose no one understands. Some call it a seed bag, others a me purse, a symbol of divine knowledge. The same motif appears in distant lands, Göbekli Tepe, Assyria, even the art of the Olmecs across the ocean. The same gesture, the same mysterious satchel. Was it coincidence or a trace of an ancient, dispersed memory of teachers who brought wisdom after the flood? Mainstream archaeology hesitates at such speculation, preferring independent invention. But the parallels are difficult to ignore. The Sumerians themselves believed their wisdom came from the Abzu, an abyss beneath both sea and consciousness. Their myths tell of beings called the Apko, 7 sages who rose from the waters to teach humanity law, mathematics, agriculture. They were half fish, half man, guardians of the deep. When the flood came, they returned to the waters, promising to rise again when the world was ready. In later Babylonian writings, the Apkal were depicted as priests wearing fish skins, ritual impersonations of these primeval teachers. But what if those rituals preserved more than symbolism? Could the Sumerians have encoded real memories of contact with survivors of a lost world, or remnants of an earlier culture that escaped the deluge by sea? Modern scholars like W.G. Lambert and Jeremy Black saw the Apkallu as mythic personifications of ancient wisdom. But even they admitted that the uniformity of Sumerian knowledge implied an external source. There was no learning curve, no experimentation layer, no transitional archaeology between primitive and advanced. It was as though civilization remembered itself overnight. If this inheritance theory is true, then the knowledge that built Sumer was not new. It was recovered. The flood had not erased everything. It had buried the libraries, scattered the languages, fractured memory. What emerged afterward was a reconstruction, guided by fragments of what the ancients called heavenly decrees. And so the Sumerians became the first historians of forgetting. Their myths about divine instruction are not self-flattery but mourning. They knew what they had lost. They recorded their own astonishment at suddenly possessing tools they could not have invented. Even their art reflects this tension. Statues from Tel Asmar show wide-eyed figures, hands clasped in perpetual awe. They are not idols of pride but of bewilderment, the posture of beings aware that their knowledge exceeds their understanding. That is the essence of forbidden knowledge, to remember more than one should. In the end, perhaps this is why the Sumerians wrote so much. They feared the flood of forgetting would return. Every tablet was a wall against amnesia. Every inscription was a spell of survival. And still, most of their writings remain buried. Tens of thousands of tablets untranslated, sealed in museum basements or eroding in desert winds. We read fragments. And even those fragments change us. The first civilization still speaks, though faintly, through the dust. It tells us that knowledge is not linear. It drowns, resurfaces, and drowns again. It tells us that memory, like water, has its own tides. Perhaps the greatest mystery of Sumer is not how they learned so much, but how much they tried not to forget. For somewhere beneath those temples of baked brick, beneath the tablets and their numbers, lies the same seed that has always haunted humanity, the the sense that what we call discovery is only remembrance. And maybe that is the truest secret of all knowledge. It never begins. It only returns. If there was one thing the Sumerians trusted more than their gods, it was pattern. They built their cities, their myths, and even their mathematics upon it. They believed the same order that moved the stars also moved kings and rivers, and that the human mind was simply a smaller reflection of the cosmic design. Their temples were blueprints of heaven drawn into clay. Each ratio echoed the motions above. And within those ratios, perhaps, lay the oldest code, one that spoke in numbers rather than words, as if the universe had once whispered its laws directly into human architecture. It is strange, then, that what we call geometry today may have been for them a form of worship. The temples of Eridu and Uruk are all constructed around the same ratios, 4:6:9 and 1:2:3. The same proportions found later in Egyptian pyramids and Greek harmonics. These patterns are not accidental. The Sumerians measured their world with a sexagesimal or base 60 system, dividing the circle into 360 degrees and the hour into 60 minutes. That same system still governs our timekeeping and navigation. They believed 60 was the number of perfection, the product of heaven and earth, male and female, sun and moon. The god Anu, ruler of the heavens, was assigned the number 60. Numbers were not symbols. They were beings, living expressions of divine hierarchy. And what of the stars that those numbers described? The Sumerians mapped them with an accuracy modern astronomers did not rediscover until the Classical Age. The Emerald Appen tablets, catalogues of constellations and their risings, show knowledge of the ecliptic, of solstices, and even of the precession of the equinoxes. They recorded Venus's 8-year cycle, Jupiter's 12-year circuit, the 223-month Saros eclipse period, all centuries before Babylonian astrology formalized these ideas. Such precision raises uncomfortable questions. No civilization begins with advanced astronomy. Observation on that scale takes generations, even thousands of years. So who observed before the Sumerians? Some researchers argue that this knowledge was encoded, not discovered. The temple blueprints themselves form a kind of star map. Eridu's ziggurat aligns with the rising of Canopus, the brightest star of the southern horizon. Ur's great ziggurat points toward the equinoctial sun. Nippur's temple of Enlil is oriented to the north celestial pole. When plotted together, the three sites form a geometric triad that mirrors the belt of Orion. Whether coincidence or intention, the result is unnerving. The land itself becomes a reflection of the sky. There is a Sumerian phrase carved into a late tablet, Kingi as on earth, so in heaven. It was more than poetry. It was instruction. To build rightly on earth was to maintain the balance above. Every foundation was a calibration, every cornerstone an equation. When the gods departed after the flood, humanity was left with their geometry, a code of order hidden in form and proportion. Mathematical tablets from Nippur and Sippar show evidence of trigonometric reasoning centuries before Pythagoras. The Plimpton 322 tablet, discovered in the 1940s, lists perfect Pythagorean triples, integer ratios defining right-angled triangles. Historians still debate its purpose. Was it a teaching tool or something more? Its sequences could also be used to predict planetary motion or to design structures of precise astronomical alignment. In other words, it is a formula for harmony, whether in stone or in stars. This union of architecture and astronomy hints at a forgotten understanding, that the cosmos was not a place but a pattern, a rhythm of relationships. When the Sumerians spoke of the me, those sacred laws of civilization, they meant exactly this. The blueprint that connects the smallest act to the movement of heaven. To lose the code was to fall into chaos. To recover it was to restore kingship. We who live under electric skies might find that idea strange. Yet modern science echoes it in whispers. The same ratios that shaped the Sumerian temples, 2:3, 2:3:5, govern orbital resonances in the solar system, the spacing of planetary rings, even the harmonics of atoms. Whether coincidence or cosmic continuity, it is as if the ancient builders intuited that creation itself is mathematical. But where did their precision come from? Some scientists suggest careful observation across generations. Yet the Sumerians had only recently emerged from the flood layer. Their earliest texts already used base 60 division, a system requiring advanced abstraction. There are no signs of earlier experimentation, no primitive counting sticks, no gradual refinement. The code appears complete, inherited rather than invented. In myth, this knowledge came from the god Enki, Lord of Wisdom, who set the stars in their stations and taught humanity to read them. His temple at Eridu was called Iabzu, the House of the Deep. Inside, priests performed rituals timed to the heliacal risings of key stars. Each observation was a sacred act. Each measurement was a dialogue with eternity. They were not gazing upward. They were listening. When we look at those same constellations now, we assign them shapes of animals and heroes, remnants of a later mythology. But in Sumer, the constellations were verbs, not nouns, actions of the cosmos. The bull of heaven was not a beast but a force, the seasonal surge of fertility after the floodwaters receded. The scorpion was decay, the darkness that follows abundance. The lion was dominion, the rise of kingship. These celestial metaphors governed the rhythm of human life. Society was synchronized with the stars. Even their cities carried stellar names. Uar, the light; Larsa, the heart of the sun; Sipar, city of the rising dawn. The ziggurats were stairways not to heaven but through it, architectural calendars marking the passage of time. At the top of each stood a small room, the Bitkilit, where priests waited during solstices and eclipses. There, through slits in the walls, they could watch the sky realign with their earthly geometry. To witness that harmony was to confirm that order still held, that the gods had not abandoned their code. It is no accident that the Sumerians' word for scribe, dubsar, literally means tablet writer, but also keeper of stars. Writing and astronomy were twins. Both translated the infinite into lines. Every wedge pressed into clay mirrored the tracks of the planets across the firmament. To write was to participate in the same divine act that created the world, to make marks of meaning in the void. Perhaps this is why the Sumerians viewed history as cyclical. When the stars shifted, so too did kingship. Ages ended, dynasties fell, floods came, and memory reset. The sky was their calendar of fate. They believed the code of the cosmos could be read but never rewritten. Even the gods followed it. Modern humanity has decoded that same sky through telescopes and equations. Yet somehow the mystery feels greater, not smaller. The more we know, the more their intuition seems correct. That order and beauty are not accidents but language. And maybe the first language was not spoken at all. It was measured. When you stand under the desert stars tonight, far from noise and light, you can almost feel it, the slow turning of the heavens, the pulse of invisible ratios binding everything together. The same geometry that shaped the first temples hums quietly in your bones. The Sumerians might say that you are remembering. And perhaps you are. For even now, after thousands of years, the code still works. The stars still move in harmony. And somewhere beneath the dust of Eridu, the first mathematicians sleep, their equations carved into clay, still whispering the secret their world once knew, that the cosmos and the mind are made of the same pattern, repeating forever. In the mythology of Sumer, one god stands apart from all others, not because of thunder or conquest, but because of silence. Enki, lord of the deep waters, master of wisdom, the keeper of secrets. He does not command storms or armies. He listens. He waits in the abyss, in the quiet beneath creation, where memory and water are one. When the flood came to erase the world, Enki alone refused to forget. He became the silent witness of time's first catastrophe. Every civilization invents gods in its own image. But Enki is different. Less a being than a principle, an intelligence that bridges chaos and order. His dwelling place, the Abzu, was the underworld sea beneath the earth, the same deep from which the rivers rose. To the Sumerians, that abyss was not a void but a reservoir of potential, the memory of all things before they were named. Enki ruled it not by force but by understanding. His temple in Eridu, Abzu, House of the Deep, was the oldest of all, and its foundations lay upon layers of time older than history itself. Scientists have uncovered those layers. At Eridu's base, below 20 generations of rebuilding, they found the faint outline of a small sanctuary, its floor blackened by centuries of offerings. Around it, bits of mother-of-pearl, lapis lazuli, and fragments of early writing. It is said that priests came there to draw water from a sacred well, a literal connection to the Abzu. To drink it was to commune with the source of life. Even in ruins, the place feels alive. The wind carries salt from the vanished sea. The ground hums faintly, as though still remembering prayers whispered 5,000 years ago. The myths say that when Enlil, the storm god, decided to destroy humanity for its noise, Enki could not bear it. Bound by divine law not to interfere directly, he whispered through reeds to warn the humans Isidra, build a vessel and preserve the seed of life. In that act of quiet rebellion, Enki saved memory itself. He did not challenge fate. He outwitted it. When the flood passed, he taught the survivors how to measure the fields again, how to build canals, how to count time. He restored what the waters had taken. In a way, Enki represents the continuity between the worlds before and after the flood. He is the bridge, the whisper that carried knowledge through oblivion. The Sumerians believed that all wisdom, music, architecture, language, healing, originated from his domain. To invoke Enki was to seek harmony with the unseen logic of existence. His symbols, the fish, the goat, the flowing streams, spoke of transformation and balance. He was not the god of power but of pattern. Modern scholars often interpret Enki as a personification of fresh water, the life-giving irrigation that sustained Sumer cities. Yet his mythic dimension feels deeper, more abstract. He is the embodiment of memory that survives disaster, the persistence of intelligence across resets of time. If kingship descended from heaven, then wisdom rose from the deep. The heavens gave rule. The abyss gave understanding. That duality, sky and sea, order and chaos, lies at the heart of every Sumerian myth. In their cosmology, creation itself began when the fresh waters of the Abzu mingled with the salt sea of Tiamat, birthing the gods. From that union of opposites came the world, the stars, and the first light. But Enki remained in the depths, watching. He was not a creator in the usual sense. He was a custodian, ensuring that the cycle continued. When knowledge was misused, he withdrew it. When it was forgotten, he restored it. Some ancient hymns describe him as the one who reads the tablets of destiny. In Babylonian myth, those tablets controlled the fate of gods and men alike. To read them was to understand the structure of the universe itself. Enki never claimed to write them, only to interpret. He was the first scientist, the first philosopher, perhaps even the first archivist of time. In his temple were said to rest the me, the sacred decrees that define civilization, law, ritual, architecture, wisdom, and compassion. Without them, the world would collapse into confusion. In that sense, Enki is less a myth and more a metaphor for human consciousness itself, the quiet intelligence that observes, adapts, survives. When the flood erased memory, Enki became its custodian. He is the mind that remembers what the heart forgets. Some scholars see in Enki echoes of later deities, Ea of Babylon, Poseidon of Greece, Neptune of Rome. Even the Hebrew notion of divine wisdom, Chokmah, bears resemblance. Wherever his name traveled, it carried the same paradox, a god of both creation and subversion, of obedience and defiance. He saves the world not by fighting but by whispering. If the Sumerian King List records history as a succession of divine interventions, Enki's presence is the thread connecting them all. When kingship descends from heaven, it is through his waters. When it ascends again, it sinks back into the Abzu. The pattern repeats endlessly: revelation, loss, remembrance. Enki is the pulse of that rhythm, the deep intelligence that ensures the cycle never ends. The archaeologist Samuel Noah Kramer once remarked that Enki's myths read like a philosophy of equilibrium. In his stories, balance is the highest virtue. Even the flood, though tragic, is necessary, a purification before renewal. Perhaps that is why the Sumerians built their earliest temples not on mountains but near marshes and deltas. They sought the liminal places where water and land meet, where creation and destruction merge. To stand at the edge of the Abzu was to stand at the threshold of understanding. Modern interpreters sometimes dismiss such myths as allegory. Yet their insight feels timeless. The story of Enki is not about gods. It is about the endurance of knowledge. Civilizations may drown, empires crumble, languages fade, but the pattern beneath remains. Enki is that pattern. He watches as humanity rises and falls, as kings forget and rediscover the same truths, as each age believes itself the first. And perhaps he still waits, silent as ever, in the deep. If you imagine the marshlands of southern Iraq today, the still pools, the reeds swaying in hot wind, you might almost hear it, the faint sound of water moving beneath the surface, murmuring like breath. The people who live there still call it Aden, the plain of Eden. They fish and farm as their ancestors did, unaware that beneath their boats lie the ruins of Eridu, the first city. Somewhere below, Enki's temple sleeps, sealed under silt, its walls soaked with the very waters it once sanctified. Maybe that is how wisdom survives, not in noise or conquest, but in quiet endurance. It sinks, waits, and returns when the world is ready again. The silent witness of Sumer still listens, deep beneath the earth. And sometimes, in the hush before dawn, when the desert cools and the stars tremble on the horizon, you can almost feel his presence, the memory of water, the whisper of time, the voice that never needed to be heard to be believed. History, as we know it, is a palimpsest, an ancient tablet written, erased, and written again. Beneath every official chronicle lies another story, faint but persistent, like an inscription barely visible beneath the surface of clay. The Sumerians knew this instinctively. Time was not a line but a circle, a spiral of remembering and forgetting. But when empires rose after them, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, Greece, Rome, the spiral began to tighten. What had once been memory became myth, and what had been myth was quietly rewritten as history. It is a strange fate that the oldest recorded civilization should also be the most edited. The Sumerian King List, which began as a sacred record of rulers before and after the flood, did not remain untouched. Later scribes, Babylonian, Assyrian, even Persian, copied and adjusted it, trimming reigns, changing names, inserting their own dynasties. The result is a tapestry of versions. The Weld Blundell prism, the Nippur tablet, the Uruk fragments, each slightly different, each shaped by the hand of the age that copied it. Time itself was edited in clay. To the Babylonians, history was power. The right to rule was inherited not through blood but through narrative. Whoever controlled the story of kingship controlled the divine mandate of civilization. And so the king list evolved from remembrance to justification. The antediluvian rulers, whose reigns spanned hundreds of centuries, became convenient symbols of divine authority. Later kings, claiming descent from these mythical forebears, rewrote themselves into the continuum of eternity. But what was lost in that rewriting? The earliest version of the king list, discovered at Larsa, ends abruptly after the flood, no mention of Akkad, of Sargon the Great, or of later dynasties. It is a record suspended between worlds. By the time of the Babylonian copies, however, the narrative had grown longer, more political. The reigns of certain cities were exaggerated, others diminished. Some kings were erased entirely. The continuity of memory was replaced with the convenience of empire. Even the gods were not immune to revision. Enki, once the quiet custodian of wisdom, was recast as a more obedient servant of the celestial hierarchy. Enlil, the storm god, became dominant, a reflection of the militarized states that followed Sumer. The flood, once a metaphor for cyclical renewal, hardened into moral punishment. Knowledge, once divine inheritance, became taboo. The story was no longer about remembering. It was about obedience. Every empire inherits the ruins of the last, and with them, the temptation to reshape the past. When Hammurabi rose in Babylon around 1750 BC, he carved his laws upon a stele of black basalt, claiming divine origin. Yet in those laws lie echoes of Sumerian codes, older, gentler, more concerned with balance than punishment. The shift from wisdom to authority had begun. History was becoming linear, a story with winners and losers, beginnings and ends. By the time the Assyrians ruled from Nineveh, the rewriting had become an industry. Scribes were trained not only to record events but to curate them. Clay tablets in the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal contain edited versions of ancient Sumerian hymns, their meanings subtly altered to glorify Assyrian kings. The gods now spoke in the dialect of conquest. Where Sumer had sung of equilibrium, later empires sang of dominion. And yet, beneath every layer of propaganda, the older language persisted. Fragments of the original hymns survive within later versions, like fossils embedded in newer stone. Scholars can trace them through linguistic analysis, slightly archaic verb forms, older symbols, phrases that no longer fit the grammar of later ages. These relics reveal something extraordinary, that even as history was rewritten, the memory of the First World refused to die. Still, the process of erasure was relentless. When the Greeks arrived millennia later, they translated Mesopotamian myths into their own cosmology. Enki became Okeanos, the world river. Inanna became Aphrodite. Utu, the sun god, became Helios. The flood story was reimagined through Deucalion. And when the Bible was compiled, fragments of Sumerian wisdom found new form in Genesis, reshaped into the story of Adam and Eve, the garden, and the fall. Each translation carried both inheritance and distortion. What began as a memory of cycles became a doctrine of beginnings and endings. By the time Western civilization rediscovered the clay tablets in the 19th century, the damage was complete. The Sumerians had become a footnote to their own descendants, their memory filtered through Babylon, then through scripture. The first civilization, whose symbols once spoke of unity between heaven and earth, was now seen as primitive, polytheistic, superstitious. The rewriting of time had succeeded so completely that even scholars approached their artifacts as curiosities, not warnings. Yet history, like clay, cracks over time. In the 20th century, scientists began to unearth contradictions. The same flood described by multiple cultures, the same star alignments repeated across ages, the same mathematical ratios encoded in ziggurats and pyramids. These anomalies did not fit the straight line of history. They hinted at recursion, at lost chapters erased by both water and ideology. The flood may have reset civilization, but it was the rewriting of time that buried its memory. Empires fear cyclical history, for cycles imply impermanence. If everything rises and falls, then no ruler's glory is eternal. And so they impose the illusion of progress, a line moving ever upward, unbroken. But the clay beneath still remembers the spiral. To read the Sumerian King List is to glimpse that spiral flickering beneath the straight line. The absurdly long reigns of the pre-flood kings are not errors. They are metaphors of scale, reminders that time itself once moved differently. When the flood came, the rhythm of the world quickened. When empires rewrote the past, they replaced that rhythm with their own. But somewhere beneath the layers of translation and ideology, the original pulse still beats. We can still hear it in the language itself. The Sumerian word for year, mu, also means name. To name something was to give it time, to make it part of history. Every year was a word written by the gods. To erase a name was to erase an entire moment from existence. The rewriting of time was not metaphorical. It was literal, carved into the grammar of the world. Perhaps that is why we keep rediscovering what we think we've lost. The same myths resurface wearing different faces. The same numbers appear in new equations. The same patterns emerge in architecture and art. Time resists its own erasure. And so we find ourselves where the Sumerians once stood, surrounded by fragments, aware that we have inherited something too old to fully understand. We live within the rewritten world, but beneath its polished surface, the older script still glows faintly. If you close your eyes and imagine the tablets being pressed, the reed stylus carving wet clay, you can almost feel the rhythm of the hand that first recorded the ages. That hand did not write for kings or empires. It wrote for memory itself. Perhaps it still writes, even now, beneath the noise of history. In every age, there are those who try to silence mystery with reason. They call it scholarship. They measure fragments, catalog artifacts, translate symbols, and in doing so, they believe they have mastered the ancient world. But the Sumerians, who once spoke of divine knowledge descending from the heavens, would have smiled at such certainty. For they knew what modern minds forget, that understanding is not the same as knowing, and that truth, once pulled from its context, becomes something else entirely. When the first Sumerian tablets were excavated in the mid-19th century, the world was not ready for what they said. The scholars who translated them, Henry Rawlinson, George Smith, and others, expected to find primitive prayers or lists of harvests. Instead, they uncovered a civilization older than Egypt, filled with law codes, medical treatises, astronomical records, and myths of creation that predated the Bible by thousands of years. It was a discovery that threatened the foundations of Western chronology. If Sumer had written of a flood before Genesis, if their gods and patriarchs bore names that echoed across later scriptures, what else might they have remembered before religion became history? At first, academia reacted with awe, but awe soon gave way to control. Universities and institutions, wary of the implications, built careful boundaries around interpretation. Sumerian texts were reclassified as myth, not memory. The King List became a curiosity, not evidence. The flood was reduced to a metaphor, and the 241,200-year reigns of the first kings were dismissed as numerical exaggeration. Anything that did not fit the established timeline was quietly omitted or reinterpreted to conform. By the 20th century, the Sumerians had been domesticated, transformed from mysterious progenitors into a manageable chapter of human evolution. Their gods became metaphors for natural forces, their knowledge the product of gradual trial and error. Yet the contradictions persisted, carved in clay for anyone who cared to look. How could a primitive culture have calculated lunar cycles to within minutes of accuracy? How could they have invented a base 60 mathematical system without precedent? Why did their earliest language appear fully formed, with no trace of development? The scholars who noticed these gaps often found themselves exiled to the fringes of academia. In the 1960s, Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the foremost Sumerologists, wrote that Sumerian civilization seems to spring into existence out of nowhere. His colleagues called it poetic exaggeration. Yet he was right. Excavations at Eridu and Uruk revealed no slow progression from tribal life to urban complexity, only a sudden explosion of cities, temples, and written law. Something was missing, a link between prehistory and history. Others went further. In the 1970s, Zakaria Sitchin, a linguist trained in ancient Semitic languages, proposed that the gods of Sumerian texts were not divine metaphors but beings of flesh and blood, visitors from another world whom the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. His ideas, outlined in the 12th planet, ignited fascination and fury alike. Mainstream scholars condemned his translations as speculative. Yet his books sold millions of copies. He asked a question academia refused to consider. If the Sumerians invented nothing but inherited everything, who were their teachers? The truth likely lies somewhere between science and heresy. While Sitchin's theories may stretch the evidence, his intuition tapped into something deeper, the discomfort that modern archaeology feels when confronted with ancient precision. For decades, specialists argued over whether the Sumerians even understood planetary motion, until discoveries proved they had calculated Jupiter's orbit centuries before Greece existed. What other insights have been buried under the weight of skepticism? The academic impulse to explain away mystery often masks a kind of fear. To admit that the ancients might have known more than we do challenges the hierarchy of progress. It implies that civilization is not a straight ascent from ignorance to enlightenment but a series of cycles, knowledge rising, falling, and being remembered again. Such an idea undermines the very foundation of modern history, which depends on the belief that we are the pinnacle of human understanding. Yet evidence keeps surfacing that refuses to conform. In 2015, analysis of ancient Sumerian tablets revealed advanced forms of algebra, methods for solving quadratic equations. Another study showed their land surveys relied on a proto-trigonometric system, more accurate than those used in medieval Europe. When these results were published, they were hailed briefly in the press, then forgotten. The world prefers to believe that science began with Greece, not with Sumer. Even the language itself resists categorization. Sumerian is a linguistic isolate, unrelated to any known family. It appeared from nowhere and vanished just as suddenly, replaced by Akkadian. No one knows where it came from or why it died. It is as if the people who spoke it had appeared for one purpose: to record, then to disappear. The more scholars study it, the less sense it makes within the tidy frameworks of historical linguistics. Perhaps that is why the most profound mysteries of Sumer are buried not in translation but in tone, the cadence of the words, the rhythm of a syntax that seems designed more for incantation than for speech. A few brave researchers, linguists, archaeologists, astronomers, have quietly begun to question whether our timeline itself is reliable. Radiocarbon dating of early Mesopotamian sites has produced anomalies, suggesting deeper antiquity than textbooks allow. Satellite imaging reveals buried riverbeds beneath the Persian Gulf, implying that some of the earliest Sumerian settlements once stood on now submerged land. If true, our first civilization may not have been the first at all, but merely the last to remember. Still, the guardians of orthodoxy remain firm. At conferences, those who raise such possibilities are often met with polite silence. Peer review, that modern ritual of consensus, ensures that the walls of accepted history remain intact. To doubt too much is to risk exile from the temple of reason. But reason without wonder is another kind of blindness. It is easy to dismiss mystery when it threatens our sense of control. It is harder to accept that our ancestors may have lived closer to truths we have since forgotten. The scholars who doubted too much were not wrong to demand evidence. They were wrong to believe that evidence could only confirm what they already knew. The Sumerians, if they could speak to us now, might offer a quiet warning that the greatest form of ignorance is certainty. They understood that knowledge is fluid, like the rivers that birthed their cities, sometimes clear, sometimes muddy, always moving. To cling too tightly to one version of truth is to dam the flow of time itself. And perhaps that is the irony of history. Those who claim to guard knowledge often bury it deeper. The clay tablets of Sumer were found not because scholars sought them, but because the wind uncovered them first. The earth, it seems, has its own way of remembering. When you read those tablets under museum glass, the wedges of cuneiform, each stroke a heartbeat from 5,000 years ago, you can feel something beyond translation. A kind of humility, a whisper from the first writers to the last. Do not mistake silence for absence. What you doubt today may be what you remember tomorrow. Clay remembers what we forget. It is the oldest form of memory the earth allows. Soft enough to be shaped by a fingertip, but patient enough to hold a thought for 5,000 years. Before paper, before stone, before even myth hardened into scripture, there was only wet earth and the desire to leave a trace. The Sumerians pressed reeds into that pliable surface and gave silence a language. And even now, under glass and dust, the clay still speaks. Thousands of tablets survive, scattered across museums in London, Berlin, Baghdad, and New York. They whisper of contracts, of marriages, of harvests, of wars. But among those everyday records are fragments that defy explanation. Instructions for building impossible machines, maps of stars that no longer exist, hymns to gods whose names mean equations, and poems that feel less written than remembered. The clay, in its quiet way, is both historian and oracle. It does not argue. It simply endures. When scientists first began translating these tablets, they expected the voice of a primitive people still learning civilization. What they found instead was familiarity, a mind startlingly modern, already wrestling with abstraction, ethics, irony, and sorrow. In one text, a Sumerian scribe laments the weight of endless paperwork. I am tired of writing. My hand is heavy. In another, a farmer prays for rain with the weary pragmatism of a man who has seen too many seasons fail. Between lines of theology and law, there is humor, longing, fatigue. It is not the voice of the first human. It is our own, echoing back across time. But beyond the everyday words, there are those that hum with something else, knowledge we should not yet have possessed. On a broken tablet from Nineveh, a list of celestial phenomena describes the positions of planets in relation to constellations that match the sky of 10,000 BC, long before Sumer officially existed. Another fragment, translated from Nippur, contains instructions for creating alloys with precise heat measurements, a level of metallurgy supposedly achieved thousands of years later. Such anomalies are often dismissed as errors of translation, yet their persistence suggests something deeper. The clay remembers more than history. It remembers epics. The most haunting of all are the flood tablets, the ones that tell of Usadra, the survivor of the deluge. One version describes how, after the waters receded, he built an altar and set down the tablets of before. What were these tablets of before? Were they myths of an earlier world, salvaged from the mud? Or were they literal records from a civilization lost beneath the flood clay, preserved by those who remembered enough to rewrite them? The phrase recurs across cultures. In Egypt's books of Thoth, in India's records of Manu, even in Plato's account of Atlantis, where knowledge is said to have survived the cataclysm as sacred inscriptions. Perhaps all these stories describe the same act, the human compulsion to write against oblivion. The Sumerians believed writing itself was divine. They called it Nam Dabsar, the fixed word. Each mark of the stylus was an act of creation, binding sound to form, thought to matter. To them, words were alive. A curse written on clay carried power as long as the tablet endured. When the flood swept over, the written word became the one thing the waters could not unmake. The clay, when baked by the fires of destruction, grew harder, not weaker. The apocalypse itself preserved the memory of what it destroyed. And so, thousands of years later, we can still hear them, the voices of scribes, priests, and kings, each believing they were recording the future, not the past. Their tablets describe not only what happened but how it was meant to be remembered. When kings erected temples, they buried foundation tablets inscribed with their names and blessings, believing that future generations would find them and rebuild upon the same sacred ground. It was a conversation with the unborn, a faith in continuity that no empire could erase. But the clay also speaks of doubt. In the Lamentation for You, a poet cries out to the gods who abandoned his city, "The storm took the city. The wind carried its people away. The temple is silent. Its songs are dust." These lines, pressed into clay 4,000 years ago, feel eerily contemporary. They reveal a people aware that their civilization, like all others, could vanish. The Sumerians were not naive. They lived in the shadow of their own mortality and tried to immortalize it in symbols. Modern researchers have begun to listen differently to those symbols. Acoustic studies of cuneiform tablets have shown that certain poetic forms, when read aloud in reconstructed Sumerian, carry rhythmic frequencies aligned with breath patterns, suggesting the language itself was designed to induce trance or meditation. The written word, in other words, was a vessel for consciousness. The clay was not just archive, it was instrument. And what of the tablets that remain untranslated? Tens of thousands lie untouched, sealed in museum storage, their wedge marks fading into anonymity. Some are too damaged to read. Others are ignored because their content seems trivial. But history has shown that trivial tablets often hold the keys to profound truths. A shopping list might reveal trade networks across continents. A tax record might prove a dynasty older than we thought. Perhaps among those forgotten pieces of clay lies the answer to the greatest question of all. Were the Sumerians recording their own beginning or someone else's end? To press words into clay is to defy time itself. Every stroke says, "I was here. I knew something. Remember me." And though their empires fell and their rivers changed course, the Sumerians achieved what they desired most. They were remembered. When the King List names their rulers, when the hymns invoke Enki's deep wisdom, when a broken fragment still holds the trace of a name, the clay is speaking. It does not matter that we no longer understand every word. The message has already been delivered. The world forgets, but matter remembers. If you could hold one of those tablets in your hands, its surface rough, the edges worn smooth by centuries, you would feel more than history. You would feel the warmth of a human palm that pressed it once, long before you. Their breath has long since vanished. But their thoughts remain intact, fixed in earth, still pulsing with a quiet electricity of meaning. Maybe that is what civilization truly is. Not the building of cities, not the invention of laws, but the decision to record the invisible, to give shape to memory so it might outlive its maker. The clay that speaks is not only the past. It is the present and the warning that every word we leave behind will one day become archaeology. For clay has patience. It listens longer than stone. It forgives floods and fire. It waits for someone, thousands of years later, to lean close and listen. And if you listen long enough, you might hear the same sound that once echoed through Eridu, the scratching of a stylus, the first whisper of a story that refuses to die. There is a number carved into stone that defies history, 241,200 years. That is the total span of rule said to have passed before the flood. Before kingship ascended, before time began again, the Sumerians recorded it calmly, without astonishment, as if writing down the weight of grain or the height of a temple. For them, there was nothing impossible in eternity. But for us, who count civilization in mere thousands of years, the number stands like a chasm, a reminder that somewhere between the beginning and the present, we lost more than we can measure. We lost time itself. Why would a civilization invent such an absurd chronology? Historians have long insisted that these colossal reigns, kings ruling for 28,800 or 36,000 years, were symbolic, astronomical, or purely mythic. Yet symbolism is rarely random. A myth repeats because it conceals something the conscious mind cannot bear to name. The King List may not be a factual record, but it is a map of forgetting, a coded confession that the past once stretched far beyond our memory's reach. The Sumerians divided existence into before the flood and after. That division is not just temporal but existential. Before the flood, the world was inhabited by beings who walked with gods, whose lifespans matched the rhythms of the heavens. After the flood, time contracted, flesh weakened, and knowledge faded. Every ancient text, Sumerian, Egyptian, Hebrew, Hindu, echoes this same pattern, a golden age when the veil between man and divinity was thin, followed by decline. What if the flood was not simply a geological catastrophe but a boundary of perception, a veil drawn between two states of awareness? When the deluge subsided, something had changed in the human mind. We learned to count years not by the turning of the stars but by the decay of memory. Lifespans shortened, calendars multiplied, languages splintered. Time, once circular, became linear. Perhaps the 241,200 years were not literal reigns but a measurement of another kind of duration, the slow pulse of cosmic cycles that humanity once felt in its bones. Consider the numbers themselves. Scholars who have translated the King List note that its reigns follow patterns divisible by 3,600, a number that in Sumerian cosmology represented the Sar, the perfect cycle. It was the unit by which gods measured their own time. 10 Sar for one king, 12 for another, the rhythm of ages encoded in arithmetic. If we take the total 241,200, it divides almost evenly into 67 Sar, 67 perfect cycles. Perhaps because the Sumerians did not view time as we do, in fleeting decades, but as vast celestial seasons in which humanity itself waxed and waned. Geologists speak of the Pleistocene, of ice ages and interglacials, of slow drifts of climate that shape entire species. What if the King List preserves a human counterpart to those epochs, a memory of civilization rising, falling, and being reborn across ages we no longer remember? Archaeological evidence hints at this possibility. Under the sands of North Africa, under the ice of Antarctica, under the mud of the Black Sea, lie traces of structures that predate our official timeline by tens of thousands of years. Each discovery is greeted with disbelief, catalogued, then quietly forgotten. It does not fit the story we tell about ourselves. But clay does not lie. The Sumerians were not poets of chance. Their numbers, however implausible, follow deliberate proportions. Even their myths insist on continuity. When kingship descended from heaven, it was not once, but repeatedly. Each cycle of destruction and rebirth was a return, not a creation. The flood did not mark the beginning of humanity. It marked the last time we remembered that we had been here before. Modern psychology tells us that forgetting is protective, that memory, when burdened with too much pain, erases itself to survive. Perhaps civilization does the same. Each cataclysm wipes the slate clean, allowing the survivors to begin again, free from the weight of ancient mistakes. The 241,200 years, then, might represent not a timeline but a threshold, the accumulated weight of all the ages we have buried. When the Sumerians wrote their histories, they did so with the awareness that they were rebuilding after a loss too immense to describe. Their myths of Enki and Inanna, of the flood and the descent, are not naive fantasies. They are languages of trauma. Beneath every temple foundation lies an inscription pleading for remembrance. May future generations recall my name when the flood returns. It is both prayer and prophecy. The flood always returns. We see it now in slower forms: erosion, entropy, forgetfulness. Our digital records are as fragile as their clay, perhaps more so. A century of silence could erase our own knowledge as easily as the flood erased theirs. And yet, somewhere deep in the collective human psyche, the number remains: 241,200 years, a measure of the gap between what we know and what we once knew. Scientists who handle the King List often remark on its serenity. Unlike later chronologies, it contains no moral judgment, no sense of progress or decline. It simply is. The world ends, kingship ascends, the flood sweeps over, and time begins again. The scribe's hand moves steadily across the clay, untroubled by apocalypse. Perhaps he understood that forgetting is not the opposite of knowledge but its guardian, that to endure, the world must sometimes erase itself. Still, fragments of memory escape the flood. The myths of Atlantis, of Mu, of Manu, of the long count of the Maya, all whisper of civilizations measured not in years but in eons. Their numbers differ, but their tone is identical: reverence for what was lost and quiet certainty that it will come again. The Sumerians were not unique in their vast chronology. They were simply the first to record it. The rest of humanity has been rewriting, abbreviating, and domesticating that story ever since. There is a strange comfort in imagining those 241,200 years not as an absurdity but as a truth glimpsed through mist. Maybe our ancestors remembered fragments of something real, a lineage of humanity stretching back beyond the Ice Age, back through cycles of light and darkness. If so, then we are not the beginning of history. We're only its latest expression. The tablets that preserve this number are small enough to fit in a hand. Yet within them lies a span of time so vast it cannot be comprehended, only felt. When you look at the wedge marks carved into their surface, you are staring at humanity's own heartbeat, slowed to the rhythm of eternity. Each line is a pulse of remembrance. Each numeral a breath that refuses to fade. The flood took many things: cities, languages, knowledge, pride. But it could not drown the will to remember. Somewhere in the desert of southern Iraq, beneath dunes of dust and centuries of denial, the clay still speaks the same impossible number: 241,200 years. Not of rule, perhaps, but of forgetting. And the question that follows is not whether the number is true, but whether, when the next cycle ends, we will be remembered at all. Long after the last Sumerian city crumbled into sand, after the reeds turned brittle and the rivers changed their course, something continued to breathe beneath the silence. It was not a voice, not even a memory, only an echo, the kind that lingers after sound has gone, the residue of meaning itself. You can still feel it in the air above Eridu, or in the empty museum halls where the clay tablets sleep behind glass. It waits, patient as stone, carrying the weight of everything humanity has ever forgotten. The Sumerians believed that nothing truly ends. When kingship ascended, it did not vanish. It simply withdrew to the heavens, waiting for the cycle to turn again. Every loss was temporary, every silence a prelude. Even death, to them, was only another layer of the same story. They called their underworld Kor, a vast plain beneath the earth where souls wandered among shadows. But the word Kor also meant mountain. The place of burial and the place of rising were one and the same. What went down would one day return. The echo is the bridge between those worlds. Perhaps that is why their writing has never stopped speaking. Each wedge pressed into clay was an act of defiance against impermanence. When the floods erased their cities, the baked tablets remained. When empires conquered and rewrote their gods, the tablets endured. Even when the language itself vanished, the shapes of the signs still held power. 1,000 years after the last Sumerian scribe, Babylonian scholars still copied those signs as ritual, unable to let them die. They did not understand every word, but they sensed that to preserve the form was to preserve the resonance. The echo outlived the voice. If you listen to history closely enough, you begin to hear that echo everywhere. It hums in the cadence of later myths, in Genesis, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the hymns of Egypt and Greece. It repeats in architecture, in the proportions of temples, in the alignment of stones to the stars. It moves through language, Eridu, Eden, Uruk. The names change, but the sound remains. We inherit vibrations without knowing their origin, living inside the echoes of forgotten gods. And yet, the deeper we excavate, the quieter it becomes. The scientists who dig among the ruins of Mesopotamia often describe an uncanny feeling, the sense that something just beyond the reach of translation is watching them. They find inscriptions that end mid-sentence, broken idols with half-closed eyes, walls that seem to hum faintly at dusk. These are not supernatural impressions. They are the acoustics of time itself. When we approach the threshold of an ancient world, we begin to hear our own future reflected back. The Sumerians spoke of me, the divine decrees that defined every aspect of civilization. They said these decrees were sung into existence by the gods and stored in the deep waters of Enki's realm. Among them was one called the restoration of memory. Perhaps that is what the echo is, the lingering tone of that decree, still reverberating through the centuries, still waiting for us to listen. In a way, all of human history since Sumer has been an attempt to interpret that sound. Every philosophy, every religion, every scientific theory is another translation of the same vibration. We give it new names, order, truth, gravity, divinity, but its rhythm is always the same. A call to remember not just facts or dates, but something older, something the world itself once knew before the flood of forgetting washed over it. And maybe that's why, even now, we are drawn back to the ruins. We build museums and replicas. We study the tablets under sterile lights. But what we're really searching for is the pulse beneath the dust, the echo of meaning that refuses to die. We cannot explain it, so we call it curiosity. But it feels more like longing. When the Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer published History Begins at Sumer, he meant it as a tribute. Yet perhaps history didn't begin there at all. Perhaps that was simply the first moment we tried to hold on to what was slipping away. The Sumerians were not the first to live or to dream or to fall. They were merely the first to inscribe the echo, to make it visible, tangible, undeniable. And in doing so, they gave us a mirror for our own impermanence. Look closely at one of those ancient tablets, the cracks spreading across its surface like veins, the faded wedge marks that once spelled divine names. Each fracture is a heartbeat of the earth itself. The clay does not mourn what is lost. It records it with peace. It has seen kings come and go, languages rise and vanish, gods fall into silence. Yet it remains, not immortal, but persistent, like a whisper that refuses to fade even when no one listens. There is an irony there, quiet and cruel. The Sumerians wrote so that they would not be forgotten, and in that act, they ensured we could never truly understand them. Their symbols have survived, but their tone, the feeling behind the words, has dissolved in translation. We can reconstruct their grammar, but not their awe. We can read their hymns, but not their silence. The echo, stripped of its source, becomes ours. We inherit their forgetting as our own. Still, something in that echo stirs. When you read their texts, when you hear their names, Al-Yalim, Enki, Inanna, Zeusidra, it awakens a faint recognition, like remembering a dream you've never had. Perhaps that is the oldest memory of all, that we've been here before and will be again. The 241,200 years of rule the Sumerians recorded were not numbers but waves. cycles of awakening and oblivion, of creation and collapse. The flood was never the end. It was the breath between worlds. What remains now is the quiet interval after the exhale. Civilization has risen again, as it always does, full of pride and noise, convinced it is the first and the last. But the clay beneath our feet still holds its ancient inscriptions. The rivers still trace the paths of the old canals. The stars above still align with the vanished ziggurats. The pattern has not changed. We are simply the latest reflection in the same eternal water. And perhaps that is what the echo has been trying to tell us all along, that nothing we build, nothing we know, is truly new. We are not inventing history. We are remembering it. Every discovery is an act of recovery. Every question a fragment of an answer already written in the deep. The clay speaks. The stars echo. The mind remembers. The cycle continues. If you close your eyes now and breathe slowly, you might hear it, the faint hum beneath the noise of the modern world. It is the same sound that once rose from the temple of Eridu, the same vibration that moved through the stylus into wet clay. It is the heartbeat of the first storytellers, the pulse of time itself. And in that sound, there is neither beginning nor end, only the echo that remains.